is working.
Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى وصحبه أجمعين. To those of you connected online, unfortunately the webcam isn't working, so you won't be able to see me, but you are able to hear me. So not a big loss there anyway, so don't worry about it. So we left off last time, those of you who are new, we are reading, or we are studying the fiqh, or the jurisprudence of devotional worship, which is the study of the details and etiquettes and acts associated with our ritual acts of devotion, or ibadat in Arabic, which would include prayer and everything that we would need to perform our prayers, the 5 daily prayers, as well as that which will be needed later on when we'll be talking about fasting and hajj and zakah and so forth. And we mentioned very briefly last week that the way that we study this type of discipline is via one of the 4 schools of law, either the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, or Hanbali, sometimes referred to as madhab. Madhab in this sense doesn't mean different religion, but it means different fiqh, school of law, and the differences between the scholars in interpreting our law is due to inherent aspects in both the Quran and Sunnah, and that they are open to interpretation. And anyone who makes the claim that there's only one single interpretation all of the time doesn't understand the Quran, doesn't understand the Sunnah, and frankly doesn't understand Islam at all. So this amount of flexibility and vastness within the deen is inherent, and it's something that Allah intended. It's not a mistake. It's not something we need to overcome or anything of this sort. So last week we started talking about a prerequisite of prayer, namely what we call tahara, or to be in a ritually pure state. And that ritually pure state is both in the ritual sense, which we're going to talk about today, and what we talked about last week, which is in the physical sense. In other words, one's clothing, one's body, and one's place of prayer should be free from anything we call najasa or ritual filth, which we defined last week. So now we're moving on to ritual impurity. In other words, the type of purity that is inherent to the state of the person. So it's not something physical you can see or touch, but it's something that we say is a requisite. You need to have it before you start to pray. And there are certain things that nullify it and certain things that will bring you back into that state, namely what we call tahara. So if you look at the slide, we have something called ritual impurity, what's referred to as al-hadath. In other words, when you're in this state, you are not allowed to pray, and you need to remove yourself from this state via one of the 3 ways of getting out of that state, either what we call wudu, ritual ablution, or ghusl, which will be required for something when a state of major ritual impurity is acquired, and then finally something called tayammum, or dry ablution when there is no water to use. Then we use what we call tayammum, which we'll get to later on, not today, but sometime in the next few weeks. So I put the Arabic terms here transliterated because it's important that I think we become a little bit familiar with the terms themselves, because they more clearly illustrate what we're talking about. So the 2 types of ritual impurity is something we call minor and major. So minor we call hadath asghar, smaller or minor, and this requires wudu to perform ritual devotions. Then there's something called major ritual impurity, hadath akbar, which would require a ghusl, or a type of purificatory bath, in order to be able to perform prayers and the like. So the minor ritual impurity, or being in a state where you have to make wudu, according to the school of Imam Malik, divides it into 2 broad categories. One of them being ahdath, which is actual something physical, like a secretion of something, some bodily fluid or otherwise. And the other one being asbab, things that would be normally would be a cause for one of those things to happen. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the next slide. So certain bodily fluids, solids even, are ahdath, which would require one to renew their state of wudu. So obviously, relieving oneself either via urine or feces is something that required someone to renew their wudu. Something else called al-madhi in Arabic, or seminal fluid, and this is not referring to semen, but rather something that's sometimes referred to as pre-ejaculatory fluid, which comes out prior to that. Now, if it stops at that point, then all that is required is wudu, minor, you're only in a state of minor ritual impurity. But if it progresses on to ejaculation, then that would be something that requires major, it would set to major ritual impurity and require ghusl. So this is assuming that it doesn't go beyond that. Something the ulama talk about, al-wadi, or post-urinal fluid, which is something like urine, but it's kind of wider and more thick. And I would generally think that this is someone who's, it's not a normal thing. Someone who is sick might excrete that. So generally anything coming out of either the rear or front orifice for a man or a woman would be something that would be that would render one in that state of minor ritual impurity. Something else called an istihada, or irregular vaginal bleeding, whereas regular vaginal bleeding associated with menstruation is something else we're going to go over later. But if it's something that's due to bleeding in the uterus, not related to menstruation, or within the vaginal wall or within the birth canal or anything of that sort, any other type of bleeding, then that is something that would require to make wudu from. Irregular semen versus regular. Irregular means that caused by something other than sexual pleasure, something like electric shock or something of not a normal nature, not associated with the sexual act, then that would be only requiring minor ritual impurity. Pre-labor vaginal secretion. This is called al-hadi sometimes in Arabic, something that comes out before labor. And I think the only thing that really can, I'm not a physician, I shouldn't say that, but I think this is referring to when a woman breaks her water, so to speak, and then some of the amniotic fluid comes out at that particular point. So if she's in a state of mind to still pray and she hasn't actually had the baby yet, then she would just be required to make wudu. But for those husbands out there, it might not be the time to say that when her water breaks and she's having contractions. And, oh, you know what, honey, I think you just need wudu from that, because I learned that in class. And, so tell her before all that happens, not at the time. And then flatulence, passing of wind, where either there's a sound or a smell. Anything outside of that is called pure speculation, and we don't renew our wudu just for pure speculation. It has to be some type of indication that it actually happened. So either a sound or a smell. Now, asbab, or what I call events, are things that fall under the presumption of secretion of bodily fluids. So it may not actually happen, but there's kind of a presumption because you may not know otherwise. That's how they look at it. So heavy sleep, for example. Heavy sleep being defined as where you're not aware of your surroundings. In other words, you're in REM sleep, you're in a type of deep sleep, you could be dreaming, that type of thing, versus very light sleep, sometimes referred to in Arabic as sina. So you're just kind of, you're drowsy, you're dozing off, but if you hear an alarm or you're aware people are talking, you may not be making out what they're saying, but you're still in a state of some type of awareness. Then if it lasts a long period of time, if you're like in that state for an extended time, maybe more than just a few minutes, but an extended time, it's recommended that you would make wudu for that, but it's not required. It's required only when there's heavy sleep, even if it lasts for a few minutes, doesn't matter. But if you're unaware of your surroundings. Any loss of consciousness, which is basically the same thing, right? If someone faints, if someone loses their consciousness, if you go under anesthesia, these are all things that are, general anesthesia. These are all loss of consciousness. And any of these scenarios, then you would also have to renew your wudu. Insanity, similar. Whether it's temporary insanity or if it's permanent insanity, then you don't have to pray to begin with. But if it's something that one can recover from, then that would also require, assuming that it's a type of insanity where you're not aware of your actions and what's going on. For males, touching the penis with no barrier, in other words, skin on skin, would also require the renewal of the wudu. Malikis have something specific to them in regards to people of the opposite sex touching each other. There are actually 3 different schools. This is one of them. The Hanafi school, for example, says that any type of touching between male and female, short of sexual intercourse, does not require wudu at all. So that's on one side of it. The Shafi'is, on the other side of it, say that if there is touching of skin on skin between male and female, from this part of your hand, in other words, just the hand only, on someone else, then that from a member of the female, of the opposite sex, either male or female, someone that is not a brother or sister or parent or anyone who's unmarriageable, but if someone, either your wife or your spouse or someone you can marry, then that would require you to renew your wudu. So the Malikis take kind of a middle position, which says that touching a member of the opposite sex with desire. So they don't have any stipulation about skin on skin. It could be even with a barrier, but if it was done with desire, or there was no intention and they felt something of that nature when they touched, then this would indicate they would have to renew their wudu. Additionally, kissing a member of the opposite sex on the lips, specifically, would also require the renewal of wudu. Why these things? Why these particular cases? Because they say, for example, on the lips, they don't comprehend it as being other than except with desire. So there's no look at about the intention about that. But anything besides that, then it would be looking at the issue of desire or lack thereof. And having a doubt about one's state of ritual purity. So for the Malikis, if you're in a state of wudu, and then you think that you lost it somehow, and you're not sure, but just the idea that you thought it means you have to renew it. Or you know that you renewed your wudu, and you also know that you lost it, but you're not sure which one came first, which came second, you can't remember the order, then also that would be an indication that you'd have to renew it as well. Please feel free to stop me during any time that if you have a clarification specifically on what we're talking about here. There is a dispensation for selis or incontinence. So people afflicted with continuous incontinence receive a dispensation where they are not required to perform wudu. And for our purposes here, in terms of jurisprudence, it's defined as occurring for half of the prayer times. So you look at the time between Fajr and Isha. And if someone, if they would periodically check and they would find that at least half of the time they'd have some type of incontinence. And it could be whatever. It could be via urine, it could be blood, it could be flatulence, it could be semen, it could be seminal fluid. Any of the excretions that we mentioned before, any of those things could fall under the definition of incontinence. So if it's happening that regularly, and it cannot be remedied by medicinal means or marriage, right? And in other words, there's no kind of natural way to fix it, then they have the dispensation where such type of continual flow does not nullify their wudu. And then it would only be recommended, they don't have to, but only recommended to renew their wudu before each prayer. In other words, to make the wudu and then to immediately pray. Even if they're bleeding on their prayer carpet, it doesn't matter, as long as they fall within that category. Now, minor ritual impurity prevents certain things. We're not able to do them unless we're in a state of purity. Amongst them are ritual prayer, so the 5 prayers, and any other prayer besides that. In other words, any prayer that has Allahu Akbar and has standing and going in prostration and so forth, even the janazah prayer, the funeral prayer where there is no prostration, the Eid prayers, any supererogatory prayers, any of those ritual prayers require that you be in a state of wudu, either via water ablution or tayammum, whichever one. But each of them requires that it be in that state. You cannot pray without it. If you're in a situation where you have neither access to water or access to things of the earth that we need for tayammum, something of the earth or like a rock or sand, and such a scenario is not impossible. You could be in prison. You could be, somewhere stuck where, a type of room where you don't have access to any of those things. In that case, technically, if you don't have the means by which to get ready for prayer, then you would not have to pray. That's one opinion. The other opinion is pray anyway, and then when you have the opportunity to make wudu, then you try to make up those prayers. And obviously, if it's an extended period of time, if we're talking about years or something, then that's a kind of undue hardship. But we hope Allah doesn't put that in that type of situation. But generally speaking, it's on the assumption that you have access to either water or you have access to something of the earth by which to do that. And we'll see later for the Malikis, it could be a rock, anything that occur, from the outside. So, not to make light of things, but if they're dragging you into prison, just try to get a pebble or something from the ground as you're walking in, at least you have something that you can make tayammum on. Because you can't do it out of something that's concrete or man-made or has some type of man-made type of processing introduced to it. Also, it prevents touching the pages of the Mus'haf or the Quran, either a full copy of it or a part of it or even a single verse. Physically touching, not reading, not reciting, not on your iPhone or iPad, but the physical paper touching it, then this would prevent one unless they're in a state of wudu. There are some exceptions, one of them being the teacher or the student. So the teacher would be someone who regularly teaches people Quran and they have to hold the pages of the Mus'haf. Or the student, like student they said could be the one memorizing or the one who's kind of has to read or recite every day for touching the Mus'haf in order to maintain their memorization, as most people have the Quran memorized need to do. Then this would be an exception to that. Yes, Salim.
Does it make a difference if it's in Arabic or in English?
Good question. What I mean by Mus'haf al-Quran, I mean the Arabic, the language of the Quran. If it is a translation of it, whereas the majority of it is not Quran and it's kind of has footnotes and English translation, we don't call that a Mus'haf. Then you are allowed to touch that even without having to fall into the exception category. Or if it's a tafsir, it's a commentary on the Quran where you don't look, it's a book that's much larger than the Quran and it's no longer seen as a Mus'haf, then in this case also you would not be, you don't have to be in a state of wudu in order to handle it. To carry it on your person even by itself, you're not allowed to do, unless it's something that you carry with other things. Right? It's part of your belongings and you have it with those other things and you have it in a big bag and you carry it with you, that's different. But if it has its own purpose kind of carrying thing, so to carry it on your person while you're in that state also would be something not allowed. Again, the exception for the teacher or student. If you're merely reciting, you don't have to be in a state of wudu. So if you're not touching it, you can recite as much as you want. There's no issue with that. Then there are situations. Yeah, go ahead.
When is it permissible to pray while sitting?
Can I answer that after? Because it's not really related to this, but I'll answer that. There are also situations where it's recommended to be in a state of minor ritual. I don't have a slide here about it, but where it's recommended, it's not obligatory. Generally speaking, it's always better to be in a state of wudu as much as you can possibly be. So that would require that once you lose it, you do it again. And that would be the best course if people are able to keep that up. Or if you are setting outside of the house, it's always recommended to go out in that particular state. If you are visiting someone, a Muslim of distinction, or something like that, then it's better also to be in a state of wudu. If you are doing something that's considered to be sacred in some sense, like studying, reading, things like this, then it's also better to be in the state of wudu. Right before you sleep, it's better to be in a state of wudu, right? And it's kind of been, people who have tried it have seen that they have a more restful sleep if they're in wudu before they go to sleep, and then the dreams that they see kind of have less to do with their anxieties and their ego and their emotions, and more to do with perhaps even seeing true dreams. So that's one step towards that, is to try to go to sleep, renewing your wudu before you go to sleep if you need to do it. Yes?
Question related to this, do you want to take it now?
Sure.
Do Quranic acts count as mushaf and require wudu? If one is unable to perform wudu outside or something inconvenient, then he performs
Is Quranic what?
acts, like
No. Anything that's
equipment.
yeah, the question was, are apps, Quranic applications, app is actually short for application, Quranic apps, like on an iPad or iPhone or the computer, and it looks like pages, can you touch that? We asked Shaykh bin Baya specifically about this question, and he said, no, it's not like a mushaf, it's not a Quran, because it's electronic and it's built, based upon zeros and ones, and it's not the actual words themselves as they're on a printed page. So in that case, if you're doing it reading off your iPad or your iPhone or whatever device you have, then you don't have to be a state of wudu to hold the phone. But again, as I mentioned, for the situations that we mentioned, it's always better to try to be in that particular state. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Al-wudu silah al-mu'min," that wudu is the weapon of the believer, and so it helps a lot, even in, because it's not a physical state, it's a spiritual state. So it's always better for one to be in that. So that's minor ritual impurity, or hadath al-asghar. Al-hadath al-akbar, or major ritual impurity, is incurred by one of these four things. Onset of menstrual flow for women, obviously. Also for women, postnatal bleeding, or postpartum bleeding, which we're going to go about in a different section, but that can last anywhere from a few moments up to 60 days in the madhab. Both of those, as long as they're bleeding, they don't pray. So if they don't pray, nor are they required to make wudu, and in fact, when they're in those states, wudu will not lift them from that state. Because one of the requirements to be in a state of purity is that which causes your state of impurity has to have actually stopped. Right? So unless it's not, assuming it's not continuous anymore, and it's actually stopped, then you can remove that state. But either way, onset of normal menstrual flow, not irregular bleeding as we mentioned before, but a normal periodic menstrual flow, then this will put the woman in a state of major ritual impurity, a state of which she cannot come out of until she stops bleeding, until her period ends. And we'll talk about menstruation in a separate lesson, but one of the two signs, either dryness or type of white liquid that may come out, no longer yellowish or brown or red, then at that point she can say her period has ended, and then she can take the bath. Then she can make the ghusl. Postnatal bleeding, same thing, very similar, same type, but it actually lasts much longer usually. Sexual intercourse, and this means the sexual intercourse even in an illicit manner. So anal intercourse is haram, but even if it is done, then that also would require one to make ghusl in order to pray after that. And it could be with ejaculation or without ejaculation. So like the pen in the inkwell, as long as there is actual penetration, then it doesn't matter whether either of the two parties ejaculated or not, but that's enough for the ghusl. And then ejaculation is something else. So it can accompany penetration, or it could be by itself, by other means. Either way, then those four things would be what required for ghusl at that point, and you're in a state of major ritual impurity, and you need the purificatory bath. Some people might ask, well, why the difference? Why, those things that we mentioned before are minor, and this one becomes major? And they said that these things are kind of, number one, less periodic, so that it's easier to kind of have to do a bath for it. And number two, that they have an effect on the whole body rather than just a particular limb. So the things we mentioned before about using the restroom or leaving oneself kind of very minor compared to kind of the effect on the body of sexual intercourse or ejaculation or having a baby or menstrual flow and the like. So this state also prevents people from doing certain things in terms of ritual devotion. So in addition to all the things we mentioned before, the three things we mentioned before, namely praying and tawaf around the Kaaba and touching the pages of the Mus'haf, we also add these three. And there's a fourth actually for one of them. The prostration of tilawa, which means the type of sujood when you're reading the Mus'haf, the Quran, and there's a verse that has a where you should make prostration after it, you have to be not in a state of major ritual impurity to do that, number one. Number two, recitation of Quran. Now, all the other schools, including the Hanafi and the Shafi'i, a menstruating woman cannot even recite the Quran. Imam Malik said, how can we expect women who perhaps half of their life they're in this state and we tell them don't recite Quran during that time? So he made a distinction between recitation of Quran versus menstruation versus janaba or after sexual intercourse. Because one, you have the ability to lift that state just by taking the bath. Whereas a menstruating woman, it's not enough. She has to actually wait for the blood flow to stop before she can do that. So in that case, she's allowed to recite from the Quran. If she's a student, as we mentioned before, she can even touch the pages, or a teacher. We already mentioned that. But outside of that, even if she's not a student, even for ibadah, she can recite from memory, or she can recite from, one of these electronic devices, as long as she's not touching the pages of the Mus'haf. And again, you will not find that in any other school except for the Maliki school. So if you hear different, it means it's just a difference of opinion somewhere else. Entering a mosque too. So anyone in a state of major ritual impurity shouldn't enter the mosque. What do we mean by mosque or masjid? Because nowadays we have masajid that are kind of complexes, and you have a sitting area, and you have a dining room, and you have a multi-purpose room, and maybe you have a gymnasium. What we mean by mosque or masjid, we mean the actual prayer area. So the actual prayer area where people normally pray, both a menstruating woman or a man or woman in a state of janaba, in other words, a state of post-sexual intercourse, should not enter until they're out of that particular state. Even passing through would be kind of a breach of etiquette. We don't use the mosque just to, we don't really have that issue here in the United States, but in some urban centers in the Muslim world, sometimes it's way easier to go through the masjid instead of going around. So it's not supposed to be seen as a passing through either for that point. And the courtyard, if it has a courtyard, generally is not going to be considered part of the mosque. We're talking again about the actual prayer area. So now we move on to the integrals of wudu. Does anyone have any questions about any of the things we just mentioned? Yes.
I've heard that on Jummah it's better to be in a state of, or to perform the ghusl beforehand. Is that true? Is that something that...
The ghusl we'll get to, but indeed Jummah is one of the recommended days to perform it. Yes, correct. So now to get ourselves out of a state of minor ritual impurity, we have something called wudu. Wudu just means that which is used to wash or to purify. So as we mentioned, it's a ritual, spiritual state, not a physical one. So even though we use water, water is not really what gets you purified. And since it's spiritual, it means it needs an intention. So the intention is kind of inherent to the idea of wudu. Without intention, in the Maliki school, one would not have wudu. Other schools do not stipulate the intention. The Hanafi school, for example, allows for someone to just do the washing without the intention, and it counts as wudu. But in the Maliki school, they see wudu also as a type of devotional act, as an ibadah. So in this case, you have to have an intention. The intention could be for one of three things, or 2 out of 3, or 3 out of 3. Either to alleviate a state of ritual impurity, so you just lost your wudu for some reason. So then you intend by the washing that I am now alleviating that state, I'm getting out of it. or I'm performing an obligatory wudu, because it's obligatory when you have to pray, and if I have to pray, then I have to make wudu. Or look at it as making the prayer permissible, because we said the prayer is not permissible while you're in a state of hadath or minor ritual impurity, so then you need the wudu in order to be in a state where you can pray. And the niyyah, or the intention, doesn't need, you don't have to say it out loud. We say in niyyah, mahawluha al-qalb, it's in the heart. It doesn't have to be, it should be right on the onset of wudu, or a little bit prior to it, but it can't be after. So if you're like halfway done and you're like, what was I just doing? Which happens, some of you may not, but people, it happens to us once in a while, because you're kind of going automatic. If you don't recall the intention at the beginning, you don't know what you were doing, then we would say we'd have to do that over, because it didn't have an intention at the beginning. So that's the first integral, the niyyah, the intention. Here I'm not going to go in the specific order as you would actually do it, but I'm going to look at it from things that are obligatory, or the integrals, then things that are recommended, and then etiquettes, and then I'll describe it in entirety, inshallah. So the second integral is washing of the face, and at least once. What do we define as the face? Lengthwise from the beginning of the forehead, or where the hairline normally would be. So normal hairline, not someone whose hairline has moved back to here, but where it would normally be. Nor would we consider someone who may have hair extending on their forehead. That's not. So we'd say we'd go up to the spot right here, right where the hairline meets. So our teachers, they told us that this part right here, it's washed and wiped, right? Because when you wipe your head, as we'll see later, you also have to begin where the hairline is. So you're actually washing, in order to get something, to do it right, you get a little piece, extend a little bit beyond what you actually need to do. So you start the washing right here, a little bit of the hairline, and then the whole face, all the way down into right below the chin area. So right here. So not just the base of the chin, but a little bit beyond that. And then widthwise from ear to ear. So underneath the chin, widthwise from ear to ear. Men who have beards, they can either have a light beard or they can have a heavy beard. So someone with a light beard where the skin actually is visible from underneath, then we would say you have to do what we call takhleel and make sure the water actually reaches the skin, if it's a light beard. If it's a heavier beard, then we say it just has to get to the surface of the beard. But as long as the beard is, then the water has to get the whole beard as well. It also includes the face, the outside of the lips, eyelids, and wrinkles in the forehead. So, not to be, don't be obsessive compulsive about it, but just keep in mind that, that these little crevices and creases, and, try to be able to do it. It includes the eyebrows as well. Anything on the surface of the face would be included in the face. And the ideal way to do it is to cup water in your both hands like this, and then to bring the water to right at the beginning or the top of the face, which is right here at the hairline. A lot of people make a mistake and they kind of take the water and splash it. That would be incorrect. It's not the best way to do it, and the prophetic way of doing it is to bring the water gently to here, to the top, and then we're going to know that in the Maliki school, actually, to rub is obligatory. So to make sure you get everything, including from the top of the head, where the hairline is, all the way to underneath the chin. The washing of the arms, where arm is defined as from the tip of the longest finger up to and including the elbows. So when we say arms, we don't mean from the wrist. Even if you washed your hands in the beginning, as we will see, it doesn't mean that you start from the wrist. It's a common mistake. But in actuality, you have to start from the tip of the middle finger all the way up into including the elbows as well. Up to and including the elbows. And then, the whole arm. Additionally, in between the fingers. So that means there has to be a little bit of interlacing of the fingers. So, these areas right here, which are easily forgotten, then one must take the fingers of their other hand, if they're able to, and do something like this in order to get in between. And then at the same time, they're washing the whole hand and then all the way up into, including the elbow over here. And it's preferable to start with the fingers first instead of starting back here with the elbow. You can, but it's preferable to start here. If you're wearing jewelry, both for men or women, men with silver rings, I should say a legal silver ring, another one that's approved by the fiqh, which would be something like this, which would be silver and not heavier than 5 grams in the Maliki school, and only a single ring, not multiple rings, as that is not allowed in the Maliki school. In other schools it might be. Then they need not remove it. And they need not remove it or move it. They can just leave it as is and make wudu over it. Women with any type of jewelry that's permissible for them, which would include gold and even silver, whether they're bracelets or rings of the like, then they need not remove them. If they're making wudu, they can do it over their jewelry.
So you said we need to remove them?
You do not. You do not. However, you're going to need to remove your nail polish. I was thinking all day about this one, how I'd break it to people, but 6 hands went up.
Now, what about the nail polish that is?
Yeah, that eyeglass Sweden thing, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the specifics of it, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. Because the idea is that your fingernails are part of your hand, and that means that water has to penetrate and get to the fingernail. Now, if you can prove to me that this type of nail polish allows for that, without any type of, without any type of prevention, fine. But if it doesn't, I don't know that. I can't make that determination. Yes, Dr. Ned.
Just to comment on that nail polish, I think it takes about 25 minutes to penetrate. So, I did experiments on it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so you could pray immediately after the wudu. But there was a question online related to the last slide.
Sure.
What would be the minimum quantity of water to be considered as washing? Does it have to cover the whole face by itself, or is it enough for it to cover the face after the
After the what? Maybe they can retype the question because I don't understand it. So, as we mentioned, these impediments must be removed, including nail polish. And that would include also like someone who's a painter or something like that. If you get paint on you, right, and that doesn't come out easily, you got to use some type of paint thinner or something like that. But it's on the surface such that it prevents water from reaching the skin, then that normally also would need to be removed. Obviously, if it's a very big hardship and they're not going to be able to do it in time for the prayer, then I would say do it anyway and pray. But it's always better to kind of to avoid getting that situation to begin with. So after that is the wiping of the head, and as I told you before, the wiping of the head is defined unlike the face, but it begins at the same point, which is normally where the hairline meets right here, and then all the way back to the base, the back of the skull. Normally where the hair would end for men, but it's considered the head. And in the Maliki school, the whole head should be wiped. And the best way to do it, and wiped is different than washed. Wiped means your hands are wet. Doesn't mean you have to cup water and bring it to your head, but your hands are wet. And then you take your fingers like this, and then you go all the way to the back, and then the sunnah is to bring it back forward once, in that way. If there's long hair, it doesn't matter, then all the long hair has to be wiped. So for women who have longer hair, then usually what they do is kind of wipe and then grab the rest of it, and then wipe from the exterior of it, and then you have to come back, like if you flip your hair over like that, and then get from the other side as well, in order to wipe that from both sides. All coverings on the hair must be removed, so there shouldn't be like a hat or a scarf, obviously. If someone has braided hair, if it's braided by itself, if they're braided by, then you don't have to undo the braids in wudu. And if it's braided with like physical braids, then it's kind of something that's goes according to custom. If there's so many braids that so much of your hair is covered, and you don't wind up wetting your hair or wiping your hair, but you're wiping the braids, then we'd say you have to remove those braids. But if they're done in such a way, or they're not so numerous that you're still wiping your hair even with the presence of the braids, then you're not required to remove the braids. Yes, thank you.
I have two questions. The first question, Peter, what would be the minimum quantity of water considered as washing? Does it have to cover the whole face by itself, or is it enough for it to cover the face after rubbing it?
Okay.
And then the second question, can one dip one's hand in water and wipe one's face with it instead of carrying water to the face in one's hand?
Okay. In answer to the first question, what is a minimum amount of water to wash the face? There is no minimum amount. It's not about amount of water. It's about the water getting to all parts of your face, and that you're able. And then the amount of water is not affected by whether you rub or don't rub. So we're just talking about water gets to all of the parts of the face that we mentioned. That's the criteria. And you'd be surprised, it's not a whole lot of wudu, a lot of water that you need to actually to make wudu. The amount of water the Prophet ﷺ used to make wudu in was something like, 3 handfuls of this. That was it. So we don't have like a minimum or a maximum because people's body sizes are different and so forth. But we'll see one of the etiquettes is that we should use a minimum amount of water. Even if we're by a flowing river, we should still be economical because that's the ethics of it, not about how much water you have access to. And in answer to the second question, if you dip your hand in water and bring it out without scooping it, then we call that wiping, not washing. That's how you wipe. Your hands get wet, you bring it back out. But you actually have to physically bring the water from what's in your hands to the face or to the arms or to the feet. Yes, Sam.
Is there a school of thought that says that one strand of a woman's hair is all that's necessary?
There are different ideas. All of the schools agree that it's optimum to wipe the whole head. Some of them only require part of some of the head, like the Hanafis, or even a single hair, which would be the Shafi'i school. I would say that dispensations like this, we use them when needed. I mean, if we're trying to follow a single school, then I would say when is it the right time to use another school or to resort to one? Because even in the Maliki school, there are exceptions. For example, if they mentioned that if someone is out in the hot desert, because this is an example going back to something they're familiar with, and the man has a turban on, and if you remove the turban, then the hot rays of the sun could actually affect him in an adverse way. Then he would not be required to remove the turban. He can actually just lift his turban up a little bit and wipe on some of the hair. So it's a dispensation for like a hardship situation. So I would say, for example, for women, if they're wearing the hijab and they're out and about, and they don't want to uncover their hair anywhere in public, then that could be a situation where they can just lift up a little bit and wipe, and they need not wipe the whole head in that situation. But if you're home and there's nothing preventing you, then I would say it's better. It's in the Shafi'i school. It's even sunnah to wipe the whole head. So. Washing of the feet is the fourth integral, so that includes the toes up into the ankle. Preferably to start from the toes and to wash in between toes with pinky or index finger if you can. Most of the schools of thought don't require that. It's not like that. The hands you have to. The toes, it's merely recommended. But then you should start from there and then go all the way up until including the ankles. Attention should be given to creases, especially in the heel, right? Most people's heels kind of have some creases back there or from walking and things like that. So one should pay specific attention to that. What if you're out and about and you don't want to put your foot in the sink and, Larry from marketing walks in when you're putting your foot in the sink and it looks kind of funny and that type of thing. I personally, what I would do sometimes is, it makes more of a mess, but at least you don't put your foot in the sink. Remember, all you have to do is bring the water from your hand to your foot. So that doesn't require you necessarily to put your foot in the sink. You need to have some level of balance, because you have to balance on one foot. But if you bring the water and then you put it, on your foot and then rub from there, then it suffices. You're gonna have a little bit of a water puddle underneath you, which you can wipe. But if you want to avoid putting your foot in the sink, that's a possible solution to that. The other thing that people often do, wiping over socks. This school that we're studying here does not allow wiping over normal socks. They actually have to be made of leather, what we call the khuf. And the reason for that is it's a type of dispensation. And whenever you have a dispensation, what we call rukhsa, like something made for a hardship situation, then you have to stick to the specific circumstances of how it was in the sunnah. So the Sahaba, the companions, didn't wipe over anything except leather socks, over the khuf. Some of the other schools have extrapolated from that and gone a little bit further, just saying that it could be wiped over something where it's impenetrable to water, like the Shafi'i school. But outside of this, I would say that wiping over normal dress socks or pantyhose or anything like that, it's in the question mark category. I'm not going to say it's outright, all your prayers have been invalid for how long. No, I'm not going to say that. But I would say that I rather follow something where I'm a little bit more sure about, maybe a little bit more difficult, than taking something that's within the realm of being questionable. So if you're wearing leather boots, for example, then that's the same thing. If you wear boots that are ankle high or higher, so they have to be above the ankle, and you're already in a state of wudu when you put them on, as we'll see later, then you can wipe right over those boots if you desire. But then you have to pray with them. You can't take them off, obviously. Another integral of wudu specific to the Maliki school is something called al-fawr or al-mawala, or immediacy. So all integrals should be done continuously without pause between any one of them. So if I wash my face and then I hear the phone ring and I leave, or I hear the doorbell, and then I answer the door, and then it was a delivery man and they're bringing something for delivery, and then I sign for it, and before I know it, half an hour passes by. We would say at this point you'd have to start over, right? Because you've kind of obviated the idea of things happening one step after the other. So, you wash your face, and then you wash your arms, and then you wipe your head, then you wash your feet. So to keep it in that order, all of them without great amount of pause between. What is the allowable amount of pause? In the amount of time that it would normally take for one of those limbs to dry without towel wiping, but just to dry by itself via evaporation in a moderate climate, right? So not in the hottest climate in the world, but also not in the coldest. So we're talking minutes, we're not talking hours. So a certain number of minutes, if that comes by and then you didn't finish the wudu, then we would say you'd have to start over again. And then on the conditions of ability and awareness, right? You may have forgotten, then we would say just start over where you left off. Or you have the ability to do so. Maybe you're someone who moves very slowly, right? And you're just not able to, takes a long time. Then we would say someone is not required to adhere to that per se. But normally speaking, immediacy, to do one after the other, which we don't think about, but sometimes things interrupt us. And then finally, dalk, tadlik, or rubbing. So all limbs that are washed should also be rubbed. Why? Because washing means that there's some type of rubbing with it. Otherwise, it would be considered a type of wiping. At least that's how the Malikis looked at it. And then the hadith of Aisha, the Prophet ﷺ told Aisha that she should make dalk when she's washing. So all of the wash limbs, which would be the face and the arms and the feet, only those three, there should be dalk. And what we mean by rubbing is passing the hand over the limb, either while applying to the water to it simultaneously, or immediately after, while the limb is still wet. Right? So in those difficult public bathroom situations, you may not necessarily have to, try to put the water on and rub at the same time, but bring the water to it, and as long as your limb is wet, you can do this immediately after, and it's fine. That's okay too. And don't overdo it with the rubbing. Absolute certainty in terms of the water getting to your limb is not necessary, right? I don't have to be like, oh wait, I missed, a square nanometer on my, left index finger, so I think I have to do, and then I have to put it under a, magnifying glass and see. None of that. But what we say, غلبت الظن. In other words, in as much as you did your effort and you did it. And for many people, we smile, but for many people, it's a real struggle. People have OCD type of tendencies. Wudu especially, people who could spend up to half an hour in the bathroom making wudu because they always think that they missed something or they didn't do it right or they have to do it over again. And believe it or not, our ulama 1,000 years ago talked about that. Right now we have like an acronym for it, OCD, and back then they knew what it was, right? And they knew that certain people were prone to that. And there are certain fiqh rules that apply to people who are in this condition. So one of them being, in wudu, for example, we don't need absolute certainty. We're not supposed to try for that either. We're only supposed to try in as much as we think is, we've reached it. And for someone who has this particular, disorder, then they are to ignore their misgivings, either in the prayer or in the wudu. Right? So if it's in the wudu, if they finish their wudu and say, oh wait, did I get that? Or did I get this? And every time they make wudu, they think about that, ignore it. Ignore it completely. We'll say for the average person, though, where that's not an issue, and they think, oh, did I remember that or not? In their particular situation, that scenario, no, they should go back and do it over. But for someone who it's a continuous thing, we tell them, ignore it completely and go on. Just like in the prayer, if someone is not sure if they're on their third or in their fourth rak'ah, and they say, the average person will say, تبني على الأقل. So you assume it's 3, even though it might be 4. But for the person who is prone to OCD, we would say, no, it's 3, and ignore your misgivings. Go with the lower number, in other words, assume that you did the higher number, and continue the prayer. So completely ignore it. You got a question? Oh, okay. And Ahmed Zarruq, mashallah, he has one of the scholars of Fes from the 15th century. He has a book that he wrote specifically, not about this issue, but he talks at some length about this issue of, in Arabic it's called waswasa, right? And waswasa means, you find that word also in Surah An-Nas talking about Shaitan, الَّذِي يُوَسْوِسُ فِي صُدُورِ النَّاسِ مِنَ الْجِنَّةِ وَالنَّاسِ. So waswasa is seen as type of a satanic thought, because it anything that will be a barrier between you and your devotional acts, a barrier between you and God, Shaitan loves that. So one of the things he tries to do is to give you these misgivings and say, you know what, you didn't do it exactly right. You need to do it perfectly. Go back and do it again. Right? So this type of waswasa is something that kind of is satanic in nature. And the number one thing about it is that you ignore it. And number two, the words that he's saying to you, they're not real. When he tells you that, or your internal misgivings tell you that you didn't do it right, you can do it better. It's not perfect, do it again. In terms of our ritual devotional acts, there's no such thing as perfect. We're not going to get to perfect, right? You will never be able to do what you owe to God. It's not within your capacity, so why are you even trying for it? What you're asked to do is follow the sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That is in as much as perfection you're going to reach. And he did not, was not overly concerned with these minute details about, if I got this spot or that spot. He taught us how to make the wudu. He taught the companions, who in turn taught the people after them, and they taught us, and none of that was ever considered. So that means you ignore his misgivings, you ignore his things, and you also ignore the idea and acknowledge the idea that perfection, number one, is impossible, and it's also an indication that you don't know the sunnah. Because if you knew the sunnah, right, then you would see that the Prophet ﷺ did not teach his companions in that way. That's why Zarruq, he said, And in waswasa, he said it's khabalun bil aql. He actually used those words. He said it's a type of disorder of the mind, right? When you fall back into this OCD type of manner that you have towards your wudu and things like this. So, I'm sure there's other techniques that people who are involved in the field can do better than me, but I would say for something like if you find yourself prone to this, maybe in the beginning time yourself how long you're actually spending in the bathroom to make wudu. It should not be more than a few minutes, right? And if you need to put a timer and, to make sure that you don't go over that, to train yourself, make sure you only do the thing once, right? Because if you wipe or wash something more than 3 times, the 4th one is actually an innovation. It's bid'ah to do that, right? So that means you're ignorant of the sunnah, because the sunnah is telling you don't do something that Prophet ﷺ didn't do. So maximum is 3, right? And you can get away with 2 or even 1. But 4, 5, and 6, no. So, don't over stress about, doing it perfectly and doing it 100% right and that type of thing. You're doing as much as in your i'tiqad, right? Because in what you believe. Allah will take into account only in that which you knew, not that which you were not aware of, right? Let's say when we get to the Day of Judgment and everything is weighed and accounted for, and it actually turned out that in 13% of my wudu, I actually missed, this part here. What happens at that point? Nothing. Nothing will happen to you, right? Because you thought you got it, right? You thought you did it right. And that's all that you're being asked to do, not how it actually is in reality. That is not taken into account. So, the sunan of wudu, which is described as something that is recommended to do, but is not absolutely obligatory, I think fiqh is a type of subject where if you throw too much at once, it's hard to absorb. So I want to stop here, inshallah, and we'll get to that next week. So if there are any questions about what we covered so far, I'd be happy to take them. Yes.
How about when you just take a shower of your body? Is it count as wudu or not?
Yeah, the question was if one takes a shower, does that count as wudu or not? If one did it with the intention that it does count, then it suffices, because the purificatory bath is higher than the wudu. But make sure that all of the limbs that one normally does, they have to be done with intention, right? That's why we will learn even in ghusl, even when we do the bath, we actually make wudu while we're doing it. And it's more symbolic than anything else, because it's to make sure that we got all of the limbs. So in the ghusl or the bath, the way one starts out is actually doing the limbs of wudu first, even just once, so to ascertain that we actually did that. So I wouldn't recommend it in that way.
I remember when I was in training, we had a presentation from somebody who came, one of the psychiatrists, and he was presenting on OCD. And he actually mentioned, he was talking about obsessive compulsive traits, and he mentioned that Muslims, they wash themselves 5 times a day. And and he says this is a very good example of having these obsessive compulsive thought patterns. So I asked him the question, I said, excuse me, it's not an obsession with cleanliness that makes us do this. This is just, a religious injunction. And so he kept on asking me, so you guys, would you do it again and again if you thought that it was, if you weren't clean? I said, no, we've just been told to do it 3 times. So I didn't actually even know the details, but I just thought, from what I knew, and I was taught, you just do it 3 times and that's it, you just move on. And you're not supposed to linger on and think about whether you got it right or not. And so he actually said, he apologized, said, I always thought that, that Muslims praying 5 times a day, washing themselves so many times, that this is just an obsessive compulsive act. So, but if it does become like that, it does become an obsession for people like you were saying, obviously people with hand washing problems and issues, OCD and things like that, it can become an issue. So then the thing would be to seek help.
Right.
That it does become the compulsion is, obsession is thinking that something is not clean, and the compulsion is to go ahead and just do the thing over and over again. if it becomes something that you become dysfunctional, that you should seek help, I guess,
Right.
at that point.
So Dr. Sale was just talking about if sometimes people get to, I guess, a clinical level of OCD, then it may not be enough just to try to ignore it. You may actually have to speak to someone, and obviously that would be something that you'd have to do if you find yourself at that point. Yes.
Question. Regarding hair, are you familiar with a hairstyle that most African Americans probably wear called locks? It's something like braids, but your hair actually locks. So would that be considered permissible or not permissible? In terms
But the hair is braided onto itself, by itself, not with any...
No, not with anything.
Oh, the actual braiding it in this way?
It can start out as a braid, but then eventually your hair actually locks on itself.
What does that mean?
How can I explain it? It's like yeah, like if you took two strands of hair and twisted it together.
Yeah, like it's a braid.
Okay, but it doesn't come loose over a period of a prolonged time.
Right, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay.
No, hairstyle, the dean doesn't have much to say about that. It's, that goes back to culture and custom and so forth. But the issue that we'll be concerned with, what about wudu?
Yeah.
Again, if it's something that's done in of itself, like you just mentioned, it's fine. You don't have to undo them or anything like that. Yeah. Yes, sorry.
One more question, I'm sorry.
No, it takes money's
How
more.
about makeup, when the woman has to do it on the face? Is it supposed to use it, or they have to remove it?
Makeup, from my understanding, doesn't prevent water from getting to the face. It's just on the, right? It doesn't, mirkiyat.
How much makeup?
Huh? I don't know. Shouldn't, but it's not,
Some really thick stuff.
yeah, it depends, I guess. And it comes off easily, or more easily than nail polish. Nail polish is definitely, it's a varnish. It's a thing that water will not penetrate through. So, makeup, not necessarily. I think, but there's the, what do they call it? The one that covers up blemishes, what's that called? It's a concealer. Is concealer, does it prevent like pores from opening and things like that?
In the eyelash?
So I don't know the details of these things.
I think the black one they use, the eyelash, it's, I think.
Mascara.
No, I'm talking, not mascara, but concealer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't use eyelash. I'm okay.
Yeah.
I had no idea there was such a thing. Your knowledge is better than mine.
It's concealed. You don't see it. So. Anyone else? Was there a question online? I thought I saw something.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll stop here until next week. جزاكم الله خير. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى صحبه أجمعين. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us our sins and our trespasses, and to bless us this final day of Eid, and to bring us together once again so that we may seek His pleasure. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh.